Good evening, everyone. My name is Srinivasan Naidu, and I'm the program coordinator for today's panel discussion on Expropriation Act and land reform. It's a privilege to be part of this important discussion on land expropriation. Since the dawn of democracy, land reform has been at the heart of our struggle for justice. And today, with the new Expropriation Act in place, we find ourselves at a pivotal moment, one where real legal challenges and opportunities are emerging. On my left is Ishana Basiela, a dedicated activist for land reform. To help us make sense of what all this means, we are honored to have with us one of the foremost legal minds in South Africa, Advocate Ngcukaitobi Ngcukaitobi. If you've engaged with the land debate in any way, you've likely come across his work. He's not just a highly respected advocate of the High Court, specializing in public law, but also a scholar and a thought leader on land reform. His books, The Land is Ours and Land Matters, have shaped the national conversation, unpacking the historical and legal intricacies of land dispossession and restitution in South Africa. Advocate Ngcukaitobi holds degrees from UNITRA, Rhodes University, and the London School of Economics and Political Science. Beyond the courtroom, he is also a research fellow at the University of Johannesburg Faculty of Law. Tonight, he will help us break down the constitutional and legal framework for expropriation without compensation, what the law actually says, how the new Expropriation Act fits into the broader land reform agenda, and what this means for communities fighting for land justice. Advocate, we are eager to hear your insights. So over to you.
Thank you. I'm very pleased that you've invited me. I'm even more pleased that you've invited me to debate with Comrade Ngcukaitobi, somebody I've known in the land space for a long, long time. I remember debating with someone the other day and saying, at least Andile is a proper land expert. Because he's been on the ground, he's researched, and he knows how the system works. So I have no doubt that the debate will be greatly enriched by being in conversation with him. I'm also pleased that you have decided to have this conversation, because I think it's time to move beyond the symbols and to look at the substance of the discussion, and to move beyond the noise and to look at the practical intricacies. Because I think, as you rightly point out, this is not a pure legal matter. It's not a pure political matter. This is a matter of justice, both historical and contemporary justice. You've asked me to address the topic of expropriation without compensation from a constitutional and statutory perspective. So I will therefore keep my remarks relatively narrow. So the starting point from a constitutional point of view is Section 25 of the Constitution. It is not an isolated section. It stands alongside several other provisions of the Constitution, which are both interlocking and supportive of each other. The first one being the preamble itself. And the preamble says that the purpose of having a constitution is to redress the injustices of the past and to work towards a society that is founded on social justice, on the rule of law, on constitutionalism, on human dignity, on equality, on human freedom. And then another section that is important is Section 1, which sets out the founding values, and those founding values include the rule of law. And then another section is Section 9, which deals with the principle of equality and requires not just formal equality, but also substantive equality. And then the specific operative clause when it comes to land and property is Section 25. And it's necessary to just tease out the framework of Section 25. the one element about it is that there was a debate during the constitutional drafting process about whether to have an unqualified right to property. So if you look at other constitutions in the world, they will have a clause that says everyone has the right to own, hold, and dispose of property, right? Our constitution does not have that clause, but it was a highly contentious issue during the multi-party negotiations. The National Party in those negotiations, particularly on the technical committee that dealt with property, was represented by Sheila Kamera, and the ANC was represented by Bridget Mabandla, Penuel Maduna, and those people. And I think the DP was represented by Douglas Gibson. So they were very clear, forceful, and articulate in asserting the right to private property. Right? The Constitution ought to recognize the right to private property. The counter argument was that if the Constitution recognized the right to private property, it would basically amount to a recognition of conquest at the beginning. So the fact is that most property that white people had was property acquired during the colonial and apartheid era. It was largely protected by legislation, which created a private property regime. So it was not property established in a free market, so to speak. It was a free market that was tempered quite a lot by legislation that was essentially racist in its character. And so the consequence was that you ended up with a provision like Section 25(1), which is an anti-property clause, because what it really says is that no one may be deprived of property unless the deprivation takes place under a law of general application. And even the law of general application may not authorize an arbitrary deprivation of property. So it's a clause that says you may not be deprived of property. Now that clause was important. I know these days it's sort of become fashionable to think of property only through the lens of the white property owning class. But one of the debates I found fascinating going through those records was that the ANC that really led the debate on behalf of these liberation forces was very concerned about the property rights of Black people that had become the subject of dispossession and deprivation and, in fact, expropriation under apartheid. And there were many laws in this regard: the Native Land Act, the Group Areas Act, the establishment of the Bantustan legislation, and all of those laws that increasingly deprived Black people of property. So the idea was the little that is left ought to be protected from arbitrary state action. So that's the first important feature of the section, is that it's an anti-property clause. The second important feature, which was also hotly contested, was this right of return. It's referred to in the body of Section 25(6) as a right of restitution. Right? It's the idea that you may ask the state to reinstate the land or the rights in land that were taken with effect from the 19th of June, 1913, which is when the Native Land Act came into operation. It was also hotly contested that there was the sense, I think, from the white side that a right of restitution would cause a lot of disruption. But ultimately, the right of restitution was inserted as a constitutional right. A very few constitutions that have the right of return as a right in the constitution. So a lot of instances, you'll find that it will either be government policy or it will be inserted in legislation. But in our case, it's in the primary law of the country. Then the third is what we've been debating, which is the right of expropriation. So although there is an anti-property clause, I think what was clear is that there is a lot of land and property that white people own, and largely as a consequence of the brutal and genocidal conquest of the 18th and 19th century. So the state had to be given the power to disrupt those ownership patterns, which were perceived as unfair and unjust. Again, that was a highly contentious point, but ultimately the solution to it was that you keep what you had under apartheid, right? You keep what you had under colonial conquest. But the state has a right to take it away and take it for itself, which is the legal term for that is public purpose, or take it for wider distribution, and the legal term for that is public interest. But I think we ought to be clear that the deal was that the whites came out of those negotiations having retained the properties that they acquired under colonialism. There was no moment of disruption. The disruption was meant to happen progressively and subsequent to the constitutional process. These were the three key sections in Section 25, which is why the argument is made that Section 25 both is anti-property, but also it's an instrument of reform. In this right of expropriation, which was contested, then there are several sub-components that also need to be fleshed out. The first is that it's distinguishable from deprivation, right? Deprivation is permissible under the Constitution, and if property has been deprived under the Constitution in circumstances that don't amount to expropriation, there's no entitlement to compensation at all. And the best example of this is the judgment of the Constitutional Court in Agri SA versus Minister of Mineral Resources. In the 2013 case where the MPRDA was challenged for being unconstitutional because it permitted expropriation without compensation, the Constitutional Court said it is true that the rights to minerals and the rights to exploit those minerals were taken from private individuals and put under the custodianship of the state for wider distribution. But that act did not amount to an expropriation, and hence it did not attract a duty to consider compensation at all. It simply amounted to a deprivation in property. It's a fascinating judgment. There are two judgments under that. There's a judgment by Justice Mogoeng, who found that the passage of the MPRDA, which put mineral rights under the state custodianship for distribution to new holders, because they were no longer owners, did not amount to an expropriation. You will recall that prior to the MPRDA, the law in South Africa had been to link surface rights and mineral rights. If you owned the land, you also owned the minerals. That was the law. But that did not necessarily mean you had the right to exploit the minerals. You still had to ask the state for permission to exploit the minerals. So what that MPRDA did, it was a truly radical legislation because it decoupled land from minerals, and it gave the state custodianship over minerals, and the surface owners remained with the land. And those minerals were real property. They could be registered, and bonds could be raised as against them. And once they were removed by legislation, there was, I think, a sound debate that that act amounted to an expropriation. But the fact is that the law right now is that where the state takes away property and places it under its custodianship, not for purposes of ownership, but for purposes of a wider distribution, that does not amount to an expropriation, and therefore it does not attract compensation. That was the judgment of Justice Mogoeng. There was another judgment which many of us also seem to forget about, a judgment of Judge Froneman, which is fascinating because he then found that Justice Mogoeng was wrong in concluding that the act of taking away the minerals, placing them under the custodianship of the state, is a deprivation, is wrong. That act is expropriation, but, which is why he ultimately agreed with Justice Mogoeng. But he said, it's not the law that compensation should be paid for every act of expropriation. Where the act of expropriation is intended to reverse or resolve a historical wrong, that act, the Constitution contemplates that it could take place without compensation. Now, when he did so, he cited a case from Germany which ultimately went to the European Court of Human Rights, which said that where a new government comes into power and replaces a despotic or a racial or a dictatorship, in terms of which property rights were violated, it would be justifiable to take away property, to return it to its original owners without the necessity of paying compensation. So you then ultimately ended up with these two judgments, one going the route of deprivation in order to say there is no entitlement to compensation, another one going the route of resolution of an injustice in an expropriation, and ultimately coming to the same conclusion that in those cases, compensation is not necessarily guaranteed. So where was the problem then? The problem really began in 1997, when the ANC passed the white paper on land. The Constitution had won a strategic victory in 1990. The ANC had won a strategic victory in 1996 to get a constitution that permits all of these three elements I've spoken about: anti-property, right of return, expropriation. And that expropriation without any guarantees of market value, and sometimes below market value, and sometimes without compensation at all, depending on the facts of each case. But in 1997, the ANC adopted a white paper on land. It's a fascinating document. I would recommend that your readers should have regard to it. In that constitution, in that white paper, it inscribed as a matter of state policy that all cases of land acquisition by the state would be accompanied not just by compensation, which is just and equitable, as the Constitution says, but would be accompanied by compensation at market value on the principle of willing seller, willing buyer. It's in the policy, willing seller, willing buyer. Now, that was already a contradiction of what the Constitution provided for. Now, that defined the real ANC land policy ever since 1997. It became state policy, so that if you went to every department, whether it was housing or whether it was the police or municipalities or provincial government, every state entity with the power to expropriate believed that that power is subject to market-based compensation. There was then an attempt to sort of puncture this. The first attempt was in 2008, when a draft expropriation bill was circulated. Tokoti Diza was the Minister of Public Works. I was in the drafting committee of that. It was hotly opposed. There was a fully organized group of property owners. The banks opposed it. The agricultural organizations opposed it. The large landowners like Anglo-American, SAPI, and all of them opposed it. And that bill did not even go as far as using the term nil compensation, but it simply enabled a court, when determining compensation, to go below market value. But it was totally opposed and ultimately defeated. It was withdrawn in 2009 because the argument was made that it would be an erosion of private property, which is central to South Africa's economy. But as we know, that is not a fair economy. It is an economy that's been created over years of colonial dispossession. Until 2017, when in the conference of the ANC, a resolution was passed from the floor that the ANC must investigate mechanisms of introducing expropriation without compensation in appropriate cases, which then resulted in a draft bill passed in February 2018 to consider the amendment to Section 25 itself. We know that failed because there was no alignment between the ANC and the EFF as to the wording. The consequence of that was the final debate on Section 25. The consequence of that was then to pass the current bill. It's been with us, I think, since 2018, 2019, and it's now finally the law. So what does it say? I'll make one or 2 points then before I shut up. What does it say? The first thing is that it contains a series of procedures, right, to define what an expropriation is and what are the procedures, what are the rights of an affected owner, and what are the rights of the state. And in doing so, it splits the act of expropriation into two. Act one being what I call expropriation proper, which is the loss of rights to state ownership. It's actually owned by the state once it's been taken as an expropriation. It is a highly procedural, highly cumbersome. I counted 17 steps that must be followed before you can expropriate any property, 17 steps. Now, that is excluding the possibility of legal challenges. Right? So I found it very, very, very cumbersome and highly proceduralist. And secular, you seem to be doing the same thing over and over again, before you get to the act of expropriation. And then when it comes to compensation, what the bill seeks to do, firstly, it's to replicate fully Section 25. It completely replicates Section 25, and then it introduces in the bill, Section 12.3, it introduces a different category where expropriation subject to nil compensation may be considered. But it's only a judge that can decide compensation and not the government. And it's compulsory that compensation is decided by a judge, whether the judge reaches market value or whether they reach nil compensation, but only a judge. And what they've done, they've given a set of indicators of the categories of properties that may be the subject of expropriation with nil compensation. Those are not binding, but they are there. So there are some examples that are given in the bill where this investment of the state exceeds the value of the property, where the property was acquired by illegal means, etc., etc. Now, you can easily see why there's an attraction, or property has been abandoned, or property is used purely for speculative purposes, etc. You can see why there's an attraction to classify certain kinds of properties to be the subject of without compensation, because it's trying to balance this thing that was lost in 1994, which is essentially ownership of property was left intact in fact and in politics. And it was then hoped that the legal system would attempt to address the ownership of property under the Constitution. And over time, the fact is that there has been a catastrophic failure to address the property regime. And so then the final point about the bill is that it is a narrow bill, very, very narrow, despite all of the noise. It is a narrow bill in two respects. One, the mandate for the bill is under the Department of Public Works. And it's actually even narrower than that. In Section 2 and Section 3 of this Act, the power to expropriate private property is limited to the fulfillment of the legal mandate of the Department of Public Works. Now, what does that department do? That department is the repository, is the owner of state property. It owns buildings and schools and hospitals and offices for the government. So yes, you have a bill that purports to be wider, but when you actually look at the detail, this is a very, very narrow bill. This is why I have said in my own writings and publicly that this is not the bill we need for land reform. We need another bill for land reform, which in my own characterization, I've tentatively called it the Land Redistribution Bill, in which we must make certain choices about state custodianship over the land, about the prioritization of beneficiaries, about the role of the state in land allocation, about priorities on the productive use of the land, about the connection between land and housing. So that debate, which is the debate that South Africa should be having, has currently been sidestepped because we are debating a non-land reform bill. So thank you. I think I should stop there. 25 minutes, that probably, I've exceeded my time, but only by 5 minutes.